Okay, this week we are going to talk to somebody whose brain I'm interested in picking. His name is Chris Blarsky. People in the modular world would probably know him from the oddities that he's been posting pictures of lately. He has a Eurorack speak and spell. He did a 5U version of the mutable braids. He did the Werkstatt in Euro format. He did a mod for me, which put a 10-turn pot on a Pittsburgh Oscillator that was just awesome. And so he does these kind of oddities of the Euro world, but he actually has a thing going called Ninstruments. And it represents sort of the culmination of the chiptune integration into the rest of the world, I guess is how I'd put it. Does that seem right, Chris?
Yeah, no, that sounds exactly right.
Right. It sounds awesome. I am trying to find a way to weasel enough money out of my son's piggy bank to buy one or something. But they're really, really cool. And but over the time that I've known Chris, he's kind of introduced me to, hey, I'm doing this with a Genesis, and hey, I'm doing this with this other thing, and this has this kind of connector, and it exposes these things, and I'm just first of all, I'm a little bit and secondly, when I see the work he does a really interesting thing, and it's something I want to dive into towards the end of the podcast. He is one of the people that is sort of a maker in a way that the end result is really pro. And so I want to talk about that a little bit too, but given that he's probably, at least in my neck of the woods, the expert on game system, we're going to talk a little bit about game music. Does that sound all right, Chris?
Absolutely.
All right, cool. Well, how are you?
Excellent, and I'm very much happy to be here at your house. This is
awesome.
Yeah,
that's right. This one is in the house, so y'all are hearing the... I actually use this room for acoustic guitar recordings because it actually has a really nice bloom to it.
Nice bloom and very nice view, too, I might add. Very much so.
Yes, in my eagle's nest. So, as you probably know, I always start off with my podcasts with a question about people's history and their background. And particularly in your case, I'd like to know a little bit about your background as it relates to kind of this weird place you live in, which is a combination of games and music and electronics and building. And I don't know, man, I'm curious about where this even comes from.
Well, I think for me, it really centers around a time period. The crazy thing, and I would put it time period wise from 82 to 87, that 5-year period, I think culturally so much was going on. I think you had all sorts of different types of music. So when you'd listen to the top 40 on the radio, it would contain so many different genres and so many different creative ideas. And then at the same time, you had kind of the whole technological thing happening with video games and toys even were starting to become alive. Speak and reads were kind of getting into the hands of kids, and you could start to recognize this whole shift start to happen from more of an old school analog feel to this new, what is this digital kind of thing happening? And so it really adds a whole idea that for me, it was this culmination of seeing these two things start to happen and change, and music kind of enforcing all of that at the same time.
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about some of those items in particular, because it was a time where people sort of liked things to be computers, right?
Absolutely.
So the speak and read and speak and spell and all those things were very unabashedly, computers with very robotic voices, right? And musically, that was kind of the era where the Fairlights and the synclaviers kind of ruled the day. But we also had the opportunity to pick up Mirages or whatever to play around with sampling as well. It was a time that really embraced the idea of computers and digital tech.
Well, and pop music too just took on a whole different sound. I mean, you started seeing DX7 sound, and it just exploded, and nobody was expecting that to replace a lot of the traditional instruments.
That's true. Well, and it didn't hurt that, you know, MTV really had its wheels at the time.
Absolutely. And that's where I think a lot of people don't recognize there's a whole social thing behind it. You had arcades that were very strong places for young kids to go. And I think one of the aspects that empowered me even from an early age is that there was no real age focus as far as who was in the arcade. You had old people, young people. A lot of times you were finding yourself watching other people play because they were better than you. And then you would see music and levels and graphics that you would never see on your own because you could never make it past level 1.
Right.
And so you were like watching other people, and you'd have full, you know, adults watching me as a kid just walk through these levels, and they'd be learning from me and excited. And it was a whole social kind of amalgamation going on that, you know, is not really there now. I mean, now you have them, but they're more like nostalgia for people like me. They're not like the intensity that was there.
Well, it seems like a lot of arcades now tend to be co-located with either take your kids for pizza or go to the oldie style burger shop, right? Which is kind of weird, because I know what you mean about there being no age barriers. I remember I actually played Space Invaders back in the day. I was on the road with a music group, and every time we'd stop at a mall to like supposedly go buy clothes or whatever, we would actually barrel around and look for the arcades, which at that time would have like a bunch of pinball machines and like skee ball, and then would have like 1 or 2 Space Invaders in the corner.
Yep.
And we would just like play until they literally drug us out of the room. It was great, but you know, it was kind of weird also because there were a bunch of 20-year-olds in an arcade that was mostly parents with their 8-year-olds, you know, and it really hadn't gotten traction.
Well, it's important that you bring that up because, like, for us, I mean, as a kid, I can remember my mom and my dad being more interested in what was on TV. Yeah. And I was actually more interested in what was going on with my gaming system. Right. So it's like they had their entertainment and then I had my entertainment.
Right. It was your little island.
Absolutely. And it was great because you could go there and nobody else would go there. So it was kind of a little antisocial. You weren't exactly exposed to conversation, and it wasn't all let's get together and enjoy family game night. It was you kind of went off into your own room and you did your own thing. And I think that really influenced our generation.
So how did you go from going to arcades to hacking home systems, which apparently was a turn that happened somewhere along the line?
Yeah, it was definitely the Commodore 64 that changed my life. It just was. And it was crazy because I went back and started looking even last night and just kind of remembering some of these things. And even then at age 12, 13, I had black hat friends and I had white hat friends. We were some of us were poor. I was poor. I came from a single parent home. My dad wasn't really around. So I spent a lot of time in my own little world. And one of those things that allowed me to do that was the Commodore. But I couldn't afford a lot of games. So I quickly learned how to duplicate and rip these games. And so I would find myself with these people, like in Cobo Hall in Detroit, for instance. 3-4 times a year they'd throw a big event, and you would find a lot of people showing up there with a couple of 1541 drives, and they were copying the latest and greatest video games. And then they had a Xerox machine in the corner. For a nickel you could get a copy made, and so you would actually copy the documentation. Right. And so the documentation was kind of critical because at the time the games were so maxed as far as performance that they couldn't really use like very strong copy encryption type software. So they would go basic and they would say, look at the 13th word on page 12 and enter it in before you start the game. That's right. And the neat thing is that you were kind of a part of this whole thing that was illegal, but it wasn't really illegal. No copy protection was really set up, and there was no police or RIAA or any of that stuff going on. So it kind of gave you that excitement that you were kind of being a wrong. But at the same time, you wanted to check out the new games and the new sound and the new graphics.
Well, it was also kind of clear at the time that nobody even really knew how illegal that they wanted it, because there was like a whole industry of high-speed copy programs and copy cracking programs that were like advertised in the magazines right next to the games that they were ripping off.
Absolutely.
It was amazing. Yeah, and I mean, nobody's doing that anymore. But
it was completely unabashed. They didn't know, like you said, they didn't care if they right there in your face knew that you could copy this and that would take care of it and right alongside the ad for the actual game.
So why the Commodore 64 over any of the other things? Was just the price? Because I remember the price was like outrageously cheap in comparison to like an Apple.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And I think the strength of the community and the gaming community. I mean, some of these guys were amazing as far as the titles they were putting out and the music they were coming up with. I mean, it was kind of revolutionary. I mean, the SID chip really kind of brought that to full light. I mean, you could do a lot and you had some really strong analog sound out of it, and yet it still had this whole digital sampled kind of thing. And it was this whole different idea that you could get and achieve these different levels in games, and the games could do so many different things. And so you could be in one mood and then just change the game and be in a total different mood.
Right.
Because the games weren't as complex as they are like now. I think the younger generation now doesn't understand that, we didn't sit down for 17, 24 hours straight playing games. That just isn't
because Miner 2049er just wasn't going to do it.
Right,
you would have those little guys burned in your brain. You'd have like literally phosphor burned in your eyeballs, right?
Absolutely. There's just no way you could go marathon sessions like that. So you had to focus on just the parts that you liked and the games that would frustrate you the most sometimes. Everything from strategy games. That was the other thing. It was totally different from a normal standard just arcade style. It was like you could go into Zork and beyond Zork and totally get lost in your head, and a little bit more advanced than like your regular Dungeons and Dragons play, because now it's just you and the computer, and why isn't this thing paying attention?
Right. Well, but for me that was actually a big win, because I sort of like that fantasy Dungeon and Dragon thing, but I lived in the middle of the land of the wood tick there.
Absolutely.
There was me wanting to be a wizard and then a whole bunch of snowmobile repairmen. Right? It was not conducive to D&D time, right?
Absolutely. Well, and anything that would enhance that vision that you were having would just bring it more to life.
Oh, yeah.
So anything that would give you that instant response, and you're just like, oh, all of a sudden that's all it took. It didn't take much because you were already there and you just needed a little bit more pushing.
Oh, but the flip side of it is, I remember the frustration of getting like lost in those caverns in Zork, or there was one like graphic thing. It was actually not much of an adventure game, but it was by I can't remember who it was, but it was one of those where it drew like a really crude image of wherever you were, but I remember just like getting so frustrated, much more frustrated than I did later with more advanced games, just because it seemed like they were so simple. The fact that I couldn't get it must really made me feel stupid.
Yeah, and a lot of times you'd have to ask your friends. So in that situation, you'd
that's
have
where
to
it got social. Yeah.
Absolutely, you would have to go, well, did you try that game out? And if you had, how far did you get? And sometimes you would just go over to your friend's house and like, yeah, you just got to show me what you're doing because I don't even understand it. So it did give you that social aspect, yet at the same time it gave you independence, because you could then be way farther along in the game than your friend was, and be like, oh, you just do this, you do that, and do this, and you'd sound like the expert.
So how did you socialize through this? Was it mostly face-to-face, or were you like doing the bulletin board thing?
Well, I was the distributor. I mean, I know that kind of sounds bad, but I mean, I had friends that were much older than me, and they were able to actually, at that time, afford to buy the games, and then they would make a lot of copies, and then I would take the copies and sell them to kids at school.
Got it.
So, and that was one of the ways that I was able to even actually get the games early on, was kind of my participation, because I couldn't have afforded them otherwise.
Right.
So I was kind of the distributor, and it was neat because at the time, the things were so archaic that everything was built around trying to copy the games as fast as you could, and then you were notching out 5 1/4 floppies, and you're flipping around, and you're trying to turn and burn and rip off docks at the same time, and it was hard because it then became a kind of an industry all on its own. And I started to lose the love for the games and then got more into the actual hardware and then selling and buying the hardware. And then I remember at times, I think I sold like 4 systems when I was 15 that just included 1,000 floppies with all the games.
Oh, jeez.
And so just the time it took to build that was like intense. But when you'd give those, man, it was intense because those people would just love you forever because they'd be like, this is everything that I'd ever wanted.
Didn't it also turn around and be the thing where because you gave it to them, then you were the guy that they were calling at 4 a.m. too?
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. No, I love that part of it too because I didn't have a social life. I was kind of a nerd. I didn't really have much going on then. So I was like the president of the Computer Explorers Group, our local chapter, and then National
Which just was a sure way to get beat up.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. You didn't say that stuff like you do now, like you wear it on your lapel and go, yeah, that's me. But you didn't do that back then because you're right. You would get beat up. There would be some problems coming your way. You show that off.
Right. So, most of the people I would even say that were into early computers, what they ended up focusing on was the graphics.
Yes.
But a subspecies, of which both you and I are members, really were drawn to the sound aspects, not just the music, but also the sound of the explosions. I remember there was one game, I had an Apple, just because I was older and I had a job I had enough of a job that I could get a loan to get an Apple, right? And I remember there was one game where the game was almost nothing, but they used up almost all of memory to have this enormous scream. So when you died, the best thing about the game is when you died, you get this long, tortured scream. And I remember being amazed and also working very hard at finding the quickest way to die. So I could just revisit that, right?
No,
but then there was like the Mountain Sound card, which I got, and I was doing, trying to play around with computer music and stuff like that.
Well, those were the more interesting games, even in the arcade. Like in early or later 70s in Berserk, they had the same kind of game where the game was really bad. It was this kind of like maze-looking thing, and then you kind of just went around, and then you could only shoot like your lasers in like the primary 6 directions, and it was really bad. But like you said, it had that little audio bit where it would go intruder alert, and then you'd try to run away from them, and they'd say chicken, fight like a robot. And it was just great. So like you said, a lot of times just the dying parts of it or just parts of that game would really just make you drop a quarter into it because you just want to hear that familiarity.
Yeah. So why is it that you got keyed into the audio? I mean, was it just...
Well, I think for me it started when I wanted to actually build the game. So I started actually copying and hacking and then selling and that kind of thing. But I started getting to the point where I wanted to make my own. So part of the game is the audio. You had to really kind of start to analyze the audio. And there was a program, Gary Kitchen's Game Maker, and it had that. It was like really rudimentary, and you could build, kind of basic graphics and sprites, and then you could get into the audio track. And I found myself in the audio more than I did the game.
Yeah.
So I found myself having, just like you said, I had kind of this really bad game, but the sounds were great.
Well, it's, I think that sometimes... what you have to do is you have to find the thing that becomes an inadvertent obsession. That's how you found a thing that was good for you. I mean, there are things over the course of the years that I've really tried. I have tried to do great 3D stuff, right? I've put a lot of effort into it. I've studied it a lot. I've spent the time. And all of it just seemed like effort, as if I was having to climb a rope in gym class, right?
It was a lot of terminology, a lot of new stuff. And by the time you get over that huge learning curve and you start doing it, you realize you got to put a lot of screen time to get in there.
That's true. But, I mean, it's sort of the same with digital audio.
True.
But for some reason, that was like sliding down a slide instead of climbing up a rope.
That's true.
I was like, I had no problem spending 12 hours doing it. I didn't have to count my hours of studying because I would just sit there with a book. I mean, I would have one stack of books by the toilet, another stack of books by the bathtub. It's just like moving from one subject area to the other was just like literally where I propped myself.
Absolutely.
Right? And I think that you end up finding by seeing what you're drawn to and what you can easily become obsessed with is how you find your thing.
Well, and I think that at the time, like I mentioned, that time frame, sampling was so infant, in its infancy. It was so rudimentary. So there were so many people trying different ways of doing it. And you were always intrigued when you would hear something sampled and it did sound a little clearer and it did sound a little better and a little less robotic. And you kind of perked your ears up because all of a sudden now, they've got some real good sampling going on and you could hear some real world sounds, or people yelling or screaming or whatever. And that would draw you in because a little bit of human interaction, less computer at that point. And you didn't even really realize it at the time because you just like, I'm playing with a computer. But at the time, it's actually interacting more and more now that it's starting to sound like a human being.
So what were the things sound-wise that really, really revved you up?
The biggest one there's a couple of them. I mean, the speak and reads were pretty intense. And I remember pretty early on, I think I would say like early 80s at some point, my battery started to die in my speak and read. And it literally did sound like a dead cat. It had so many problems, but I just got off enjoying pushing the buttons while it was dying. And as it was dying, it was making garbled speeches and doing different things. And it was just a fun toy. And I remember my cousin even more interested in it than even the games he was playing at the time. And there was just some sort of magic thing happening with it that we couldn't even understand. And at the time, neither one of us understood the technical terms of what was going on. We just knew that it sounded very strange. It sounded like it was human, but it didn't as it was starting to die. And then building past that point for me, I think games like Zaxxon, the background track was almost all white noise. And it was varied white noise to where it was kind of evil at times and you were really stuck and it was trying to simulate supposedly the sound of space. But it was the first time I'd ever really heard white noise used outside of a TV.
Used creatively.
Right. Because you normally would hear it at 3 a.m. when the American flag was up, and that's all you would hear is shh, and that was all you would hear. But
it's another thing that a whole generation is missing out on.
Absolutely, yeah. Right after Night Gallery or whatever, you'd get the little 3-minute Star Spangled Banner, and then shh, and then it was gone. But the first time hear white noise used like that, and then of course. The arcade, again, really had the speakers set up in a way to where these consoles were huge and booming. So, like, for instance, when you die in Centipede and you would count all the little parts of the Centipede, it was this incredible, and this whole cabinet would just rattle, and you would like, I gotta die again. That sound was incredible. And it would just drag you into it.
Right.
So there were times where you would never hear that sound anywhere else. You could listen to the radio, and I was mixtape man. I would make mixtapes, and I loved the sound off the radio, but none of that stuff was coming from the radio. So that would seem like the only outlet you could get is actually getting it from the video games.
Right. So when did you start hacking them? How did that come about? Because especially, if you didn't have a lot of money and if your computer was sort of your best friend, getting in there with a screwdriver is sort of like doing appendix surgery on your best friend. You don't really want to do it because you're likely not to have a friend when it's over, right?
Well, I kind of got into a group of people that were into that, more into the black hat, and weren't afraid to tear into their systems. Now, and I couldn't tell you exactly why, because at the time, like you said, they were expensive and compared to what you didn't want to just destroy it. But I remember one guy specifically, Jim Height, he really kind of narrowed me down and showed me all these different ways that you could use the Commodore. And I remember the modification for Jiffy DOS had come out and the fast load Epix cartridges and all these ways to try to speed it up and hype it up. And that's essentially what you'd want to do because let's face it, it took forever to load these games. A lot of people don't even realize, there were manufacturers that actually, like Ocean, who built loaders and had different people like Ron Hubbard and stuff, compose whole pieces of music that would actually go on before even the game loaded. And so a lot of times I'd found that even that intro was more interesting than the game it was. and that's exactly what would happen. As these crackers would start going, they'd get the crack screens and they'd get all those flashing graphics and the incredible sound that was coming out. And it a lot of times was better than the game.
I forgot about that. That's right. The whole cracker thing, which was, sort of like I mean, it was sort of digital graffiti almost.
Absolutely.
They would put their front end on the game.
Absolutely.
And so often it was more impressive than anything.
And it wasn't like a nice slowed fade in for the sound. It was a boom, and it was and it would all go nuts, and you'd just be like, oh, and my audio's up, and you'd have to really kind of...
Sorry, Mom.
Yeah, exactly. But like I said, they'd have all the registers going in the SID, and that thing would be cranking, and it would be great sound. And so a lot of times you got stuck in just, man, this has got to be good. And it also would depend on who cracked it too. Sometimes you're like, oh, if this guy cracked it, this has got to be a good game.
So it sounds to me like you were kind of into the chiptune sound before it was even a thing.
Absolutely.
But it eventually became a thing, and there seemed to be very much a community around that.
Yes. Yeah.
How did that even develop? That is now when I moved on to high fidelity, right?
Sure.
And I feel like I missed something, right? I feel like I missed a link that could have been really fun to have taken.
Well, it was kind of like just the early days of the DAW movement, basically. I mean, you had your first tracker come out in '87 called Ultimate Sound Tracker. That was for the Amiga, and that really kind of changed the shape of it all of a sudden. Now, all of a sudden, it was a matter of who could compose what. And it wasn't a strange way to compose anymore, like some of the early people had to really kind of build things out of assembly in order to get the music to work. And nobody ever wanted to go there. But by that time, you had seen the first trackers come along. And now, all of a sudden, it's like, okay, well, and they were a little foreign. They still are. And to a lot of people, they see trackers with the scrolling, and they're like, what is going on here? But if you looked at it from the primary aspect of needing some real rudimentary way of getting this music in there and figuring out how to get it to play with different sounds and tracks, it kind of started to make sense.
Now talk a little bit about the tracker, though. So a tracker, I mean, I have virtually no experience with them. My friend Wally is really into them and has tried numerous times to get me in, but it's one of those things where it's foreign enough. Or in one case, I tried it, and I happened to be doing some programming in a specific area, and all of a sudden I realized, wow, this and that are the same thing, right? And so I don't want to be doing the same thing for fun that I'm doing for a job, right? But explain a little bit from your perspective about what trackers are, why they were important at the time, and why you kind of as soon as we started talking about chiptunes, you jumped right to trackers. Why that connection?
I think it's just because, like I said before, they're really the rudimentary programs that allowed you to kind of access those music parts in the actual computer were just almost too Fisher-Price, to where they had the standard 5-bar layout or 4-bar layout, and you would draw notes, but it was really no way to build a whole track. It was kind of just like, I could make a couple of sounds, as opposed to like, I want to really build a song. And so the power of the tracker just allowed you to say, hey, I could actually build an entire track here. And the other benefit at times too is that, maybe this might get used in a game. So that was the other part of it, is if I build it in this language, then maybe I can export that out and have it as a soundtrack for a game.
Now that used sample sound, right? Or did it also use the synth capabilities of the chips?
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of a combination. I mean, there were people doing different ways of trying to sample sounds, like I said, and there was different technologies in order to get it. I think for me at that time, that was kind of like the upper end in the Amiga land, and I really couldn't afford it.
Right.
I kind of had to go back toward the gaming side of things. I was more into, at that point, the Gameboy itself, more because it was just a portable format. But what I was doing before that was just taking sounds that I could build in like trackers and then just literally recording them to tapes and then making dub tapes with it. It was kind of a convoluted digital analog thing going on, but it seemed to really work well.
Yeah, but I think sometimes almost the more convoluted of a path it takes, the better the end result is, because every time you have to take another like offshoot on a path, if you're not really 100% convinced that that's good stuff, you're going to be like, oh, Jesus Christ, I don't want to spend another 8 hours on this piece of crap, right?
It does. It dilutes your momentum, and you
it
don't
does.
even
And
realize
so you have to really be, you have to feel like the work was on the mark in order to plow through all that. And I think that there's a value to that.
Well, and I already kind of knew how to dub with tape, and I just was so familiarized with that format, so it was tough for me to move past that format personally. Yeah. And I still love tape, so it's tough for me to even digitally. People are like, oh, well, just pop this little chip in this SD card, and I'm like, what? Where's my tape? Yeah. I mean, the convenience definitely sells it, but man, the sound, there's just something magic about the sound. So
yeah, I don't know. I still remember having to spend too much of my life waiting for tape to rewind. Tape rewinding was the death of me. But, I mean, that was a momentum killer. Well,
and I had an old 4-track tape player, too, that was kind of a crazy thing as well. And some of the heads would get dirty quickly, and so then you would then try to bounce it from one track to... And then you just never knew what you were going to get. So it was kind of spacey a lot of times. The flanging and all kinds of things you could do would just be like, what is this?
Now, who were some of the artists at the time that you might have been listening to that would have made you feel like that was... Because here's one of the issues I had with... Even when I was doing a lot of stuff on little cassette decks and stuff, I was listening to... I hate to admit this. Please, listeners, forgive me. It was just... It's not my fault. It was my surroundings. But I was listening to a lot of Steely Dan and Fleetwood Mac and stuff like that, with this pristine zillion-dollar production value. And, I'd sit in front of my Tascam 234 and hit record and play my guitar, and it would end up sounding like white noise ducked by the sound of a guitar, right? And I never embraced the lo-fi-ness of it. I was always kind of frustrated by it. And I feel like I feel like I lost an opportunity instead of enjoying that and learning to make music and distribute music based off of that. I felt like, oh, this is inferior. This is not.
Well, I can remember, like, for me, there was a time where I kind of got into music, and I actually even picked up the French horn and tried to play that in school, but just because I love the sound of it and how it would resonate. But I would have keyboard magazines, and I would see early on Korgs being used by Depeche Mode and different groups, and it was all, fantasy land for me, because there's no way you could afford any of that stuff. But you could a lot of times catch the music. You could catch what people were listening to, and you could pick up sounds from there, and you'd be just kind of blown away that was, you couldn't really register it. Was that a percussion sound? Was that a synth sound? You had to really hear it 6 or 7 times before you started to understand this may be just an oscillator and it's just tuned a certain way, or a VCA. But at the time you didn't know any of that. You just were trying to analyze where was the sound coming from. Mm-hmm. And they were pretty straightforward as far as being right on that edge where they were trying new stuff and they could afford it. So they had no problem sticking it on their next album, whether it made sense or not. And so you would hear those sounds and be like, yeah, that's got to be something that's processed or something. There's no way you could make that sound.
It's funny. I was just the other morning, kids are all kind of flopping around, not moving very much. And so I was like, well, let's try something different. And so I brought up Thomas Dolby's Blinded Me with Science, right?
Oh, nice.
Which he was like one of those guys. You could just tell by listening to that he got a sampler, and then nobody saw him for 6 months while he sampled like every pot and pan and fork and knife in the kitchen or whatever, right? And then all of it ended up in his first tune.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and that was heavily influenced too. You got to remember, Empire Strikes Back came out, and now all of a sudden that just changed.
Those space sounds.
Oh man,
I mean
that just changed life altogether. And I grew up already with Buck Rogers and some of that stuff going on too. But Star Wars, man, that just cemented it. Everybody was like, "Oh, well, how are you making those sounds?" And just seeing the reaction that people would have to those, where it was like alien, but yet it was something they could recognize, and it was just, and in fact, it was even stole so much, it was ripped off. I mean, most of the Transformers episodes, basically at that point, were just literally ripping the Star Wars samples right out. And so you'd see Optimus Prime do something or move away, and you'd hear the Millennium Falcon. Wait a minute, that's a Star Wars sound. They didn't even change the pitch or the timbre or any of it. It's just, come on now, that's from Star Wars. So yeah, it was kind of this unusual blend of everything wanting to be spacey and science fiction and technology and everything going at that moment.
So now you said that you started moving towards like Game Boys and stuff like that. And Game Boy has kind of a very particular history in sort of the game-based music stuff, because some hackers got in there and started making carts. I think they actually made literally cartridges that were hacked to have unauthorized, scary, unauthorized applications that were specifically for sound composition. I'm trying to remember that Nanoloop. Nanoloop. That was it. That was the first one I remember hearing of anyway.
Yeah.
But that was kind of interesting, because that was before anybody was doing portable music making devices at all that I can remember.
That was the big draw. I think it was the generation after me that really embraced the Game Boy. And then Nintendo kind of embraced them as well and did several versions of it, and tried to expand on it a little bit with the color and different things. But yeah, it was the underground scene that really kind of pushed the music part of it forward. And it was interesting to see it develop a little bit just with the nature of how people would work. You started to see people wanting to integrate it more into the rest of their existing instruments. They wanted to be able to sync it and have MIDI control. And so, the community really kind of stepped forward and put those things into place. People like Trash 80 and Oliver and the creator LSDJ, just all those people really stepped up and still even now will do a lot of support for it. And it's pretty amazing to see that kind of dedication and love for it.
Right. Well, it's clear that that among certain people that the Game Boy, and meaning not just the sound of it, but the particular screen and screen display, the sound of it, but also the form factor in your hand and the pressure of the buttons, that's like people's Stratocaster.
Absolutely.
It's like, don't give me a Gibson SG. I need a Strat, and I need it from this era. Because you see that. I mean, when I go and I every once in a while I'll stick my nose in the game audio thing, and inevitably I'll just like plop into something which is like, which was better, the 1996 version of the Game Boy, or the 98 version that had this one component changed out. Yeah,
and there's sites that compare all of them that will do sound samples and will give you oscilloscopes, and you'll be able to analyze the waves and, well, is this a little too clean or is this too dirty? And it gets pretty intense there sometimes. And honestly, you do start to develop a love for a certain model.
Yeah.
The Pocket, for instance, I mean, that's probably the most neglected version, but its bass was so crunchy and almost garbled. It was almost useless, I'll just say it. But if you knew what you were doing, it would sing so beautifully.
Really?
And it was almost like a line you could draw in the sand and say, well, have you even tried this or you tried that? And then if somebody had gotten as far as you had, then it was like this immediate moment where you're like, wow, you love what I love too. And you could really kind of build a social thing with it.
Now, social comes up again, which is interesting because it's a different social.
Absolutely.
But so social has changed. Obviously, it's gotten to be internet based.
Yes.
And so how does that change your interaction with people? How does it change, like, the way you say, oh, you like the same thing as I do, we must be friends? How does that end up going to, to sort of like saying hi? I mean, in a way, it used to be like, to me, these like super underground movements, you would be in a city of 1 million people and maybe 4 other people in the town would be into it. So the 5 of you were like tight, right? You drive across town, at the drop of a hat because somebody said, oh, I just got X, And now not so much. Now instead it seems to be like that awkward 6th grade dance, where everybody's standing along the walls and nobody really wants to approach each other because we've forgotten how to even talk to other humans. We used to just like be so hungry to talk to a person, we would search them out, right? We would look like, oh, look, that guy's kind of looking at the same bin of records, or he's looking at the same bin of games or whatever, maybe. Right, but now it's like different, and how I mean, you've got a chance to be a part of both societies. How are they different?
Well, I think the thing you could always go back to with chip people is the games. So you'd always find those people that were willing to play games and then might be, musicians on the side. And so whether they knew it or not, and whether they were thinking they were ever going to go into chip, ended up going into chip a lot of times because just their love of music in general. So you would get people like different computer stores like Babbage's and whatever, and you'd be able to kind of find out what nerds were like into what. And be able to build. And I can remember even a couple of times just going online, if you will, at 300 baud modem and the local bulletin board, and just being able to dial into my friend, and we'd be able to have chats, and we'd be able to have other people jump in, and a lot of times that would be the collaboration, and it would be a lot of times where I want it to sound like Black Sabbath, but you're thinking to yourself, there's no way I'm going to be able to. So you would just try to find some chords and then build some things, and you would find that kind of camaraderie. But the scene now is kind of interesting because it's kind of developed over time where the internet has made it possible to just be able to kind of go to every part of the world, because I think mostly it would be accepted that the chiptune scene in America is maybe a fourth of what it really is everywhere else. I mean, I think in Japan and Germany and definitely in Europe, it's a lot stronger than it is here.
You mean in terms of like the ratio of attention or something?
Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, when I sell my synth boys, I'd say it's a 90% time it's going to be overseas somewhere.
Okay.
So I don't really sell much to American.
So before we go into the modern world, I want to ask one more thing, which I'm kind of curious about. How many of the people that were into the chip music thing, how many of them came at it from the music side, and how many came at it from the chip and game side? I mean, meaning, how many of them were musicians before they got into it?
I think if they were musicians, they were probably, like amateurs at best. And not
they
really,
were crap.
Yeah, not really meant to. I mean, there are a couple that are really, very good guitar players and that will mix and meld those. In fact, a lot of times that's how I can almost stand chip music just on a daily basis, is if it's not 100% chip.
I see.
There's a lot of purists out there that say, oh, no, it's all got to be chip. No, I'm not one of those. I'm one of those where it's like any other instrument. If you listen to one instrument too long, break it up with some other instrument.
Right. Well, it's kind of hard though, unless you have some kind of mechanism to tie it in, which is where again you walk directly through the door with the Ninstruments devices. Which first time I saw it, I turned around and I saw the jacks, and I turned it back around and I saw more jacks. I was like, oh, this is cool. I mean, so. It's what's it called again now?
Yeah, Synth Boy.
The Synth Boy, right. And so it's like a holder for a Game Boy.
Absolutely. Because that's really the benefit of the Game Boy is the portability.
Mm-hmm.
And you didn't want to, I didn't want to mess with that. I mean, I had originally built a rack version and it was nice, but I found myself always wanting to take it with me. And it was just difficult to move a whole rack around. So the Synth Boy kind of gave me that flexibility, and I was able to think, well, look at all these connectors on this Game Boy, and the way I normally would have it all plugged in is I'd have to have the power, and I'd have to have the audio, and in these jacks.
Right, so you had all the octopus cable.
Yeah, you got all this stuff coming on, and I'm like, well, wouldn't it just make sense to just take everything that you'd need out of this and just drop it into a connector at the bottom? And that's really kind of how that kind of happened and we went through several different methodologies. We were just going to build a center cable that came out of it. But one of the things I was watching, even with some of the guys playing chiptune in their gigs, is they would lay the Game Boys flat on the table. And if you know anything about a Game Boy and the way you try to look at it, if you don't have the contrast, just say, well, heck with it, you won't be able to see any of it. So I tried to set it up to where it could just sit on the table at a comfortable angle with like a synth keyboard type thing plugged in right in front of it, and that you'd be able to see what you're doing kind of as an easy angle.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I was a big Game Boy fan from the get-go because I was working at this company that just insisted on having a lot of all-company meetings. And so what I found is my best friend and I, that if we had a Game Boy and we took it to these like 3-hour-long boring as hell meetings, we could really make some hay on Tetris or whatever in the course of a meeting, right? But I loved it. But I would say that at the same time, I had a little, studio thing, and I was doing writing and stuff. I never thought of the two as occupying the same place in the world.
Again, and I point back to that point in time for me growing up where there was no one dominance. Everything had equal dominance. So the radio was just as important as the music that I would play, from records, and then that would also have the same equal importance as the soundtrack and the games.
Right.
So for me, they were on equal footing all the way around, and I would in my head be singing the Zelda theme the whole day as much as you would be listening to Golden Earrings, Twilight Zone. I mean,
right.
And I would sing them both in the same day.
Right.
So that was the that's the reason I bring that time frame up. It was very odd that you would have these medias all come and form into one thing. You had music, television, MTV, which is nothing like, of course, what it is today, but it really was this culmination of art, graphics, sound, and almost a time frame too. There was time that was involved with that, and there's been nothing like that since.
Right, that's true. So with the Synth Boy, what all different ways can you connect into it?
You've got your MIDI I/O, which is probably the biggest way. Then you also have CV Gate, which I kind of recently brought with Mod 3. CV Gate was big for me. I've kind of gotten into Euro thanks to you.
Yeah, I know. I'm at fault for that. Sorry.
Yes, Darwin did a little presentation, and then now I'm penniless. But it was great because the raw feelings of modular just made total sense on that digital level, and all of a sudden I had to have both of them, and so that's one of the things I immediately had to put
So
in.
the CV Gate is that output of a sequencer. I mean, first of all, what kind of software are you running on the Game Boy?
It's MGB made by Trash 80, which is basically taking and we're translating the MIDI basically and from voltage. So it's actually CV Gate input.
So the Game Boy is providing the sequencing, and you're sequencing out of that into your modular?
Well, you can set it up that way. There's another program, LSDJ, where you can actually trigger and do different things that way if you want to actually sequence. I primarily just use it as a noise source.
Oh,
so
I see. Okay.
I'm able just to trigger.
So it's like a
things.
complex weirdo oscillator for you.
Absolutely.
Oh,
absolutely. In fact, the wave channel on a Game Boy is, I mean, if you were to try to draw some lines, you could probably say it was smack in the middle of a cycle box and a gamma wave source. It's right in there where it's like it's this whole digital monster all on its own.
Now, how much variation do you get then in? I mean, you picked two very interesting fence posts there, in that both of those have high variability.
Absolutely.
You get the same thing out of a Game Boy?
Absolutely. Yeah, because you're translating it from the step notes. So if you wanted to move and you wanted to slew between notes, and all of a sudden you could slew into a section of notes or trigger a sequence outside of those notes and do exactly that. In fact, I'm working on Mod 3 now, and I'm trying to bring that into where it's basically
What's Mod 3?
Mod 3 for Synthboy is going to be basically bringing pitch control in there. So you can CV and pitch control the whole thing. And I'm trying to make that usable, though, because like right now it's almost like a toy to where you can't really get a lot of usability. I'm trying to really kind of build the attenuation in there to where it's in a range to where it's really usable. Sometimes with this earlier chip stuff, that's what you find is that you get this extreme behavior, which is, let's face it, it's interesting for about 10 seconds. And then after that, you're like, yeah, okay, I heard it, and then move on. You have to kind of stretch beyond that and say, okay, well, what if we did different things, and maybe if we stretched it a little bit, or maybe if we changed the pitch, or maybe if we moved it down a little bit, and then you've got to figure out a way to allow those controls to be easily accessed so people can then use them.
Yeah, so now how much do you end up, how much of like your preferences end up in the final thing? So because my assumption is that depending on how you drive the inputs or the clock speeds or whatever, that you can go from one kind of complete horseshit through a wide range of interesting sounds and end up at another version of horseshit, right?
Well, I have to give a lot of credit to my developer, Michael Colson, because I like to, my whole thing with the Game Boy is I want to be able to crash it. I really want to be able to take it to the extreme to where it's almost just ready to give up the ghost.
Okay.
And so...
Oh, so that goes back to your speak and read dying.
Exactly.
And that was when it was most interesting to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it was like if you really stressed it out to the point where it couldn't handle it anymore, things would happen that you couldn't almost replicate.
Right.
And there was this whole port there where you could see a bright light and it was just about to go out. It's like that point where the light bulb just goes really bright and then boom, it's gone. It's that same kind of point. So for me, that was tough. I really made it to where the performance had to be strong, to where if you took an oscillator and you cranked up a square wave real fast, you could pretty much crush the Game Boy.
Really?
In fact, in my first video...
And it sounds like what?
It does. It sounds... It's its own sound. It's hard to describe. I would say it's like complicated FM synthesis at some point, to where like it was pushed through a crazy filter of somehow, and then you're able to vary that at those speeds. You can get it. In fact, the first YouTube video I show, and I kind of illustrate Mod 3, I do that. I just take an oscillator and I literally just take that Game Boy right to its knees. And that was important because I wanted some reality check to where you could then get the standard bullet bill, boom, and all the typical Nintendo sounds. But you then wanted something outside of that realm, like I said, because after 10 minutes of that bullet bill sound, you're like, okay, yeah, big deal. You wanted something to stretch out past that point, and that's essentially what Mod 2 really brought, or Mod 3, I mean, it really brought to that. So that's what was exciting to see, people really take that and all of a sudden stretch it past that point. And
so is that what you're shipping now?
Yeah, Mod 3 has.
Okay.
Mod 2, and I know that sounds weirdly strange that it would be in reverse order, because Mod 2 essentially, the idea was to add more variation. So instead of just the regular standard, like you mentioned, the first Game Boy brick, if you will, the gray version, Mod 2 was going to do two things. It was going to allow for a different power source to power the various different models and allow different models. In fact, I'm hoping to bring color into it, because color adds more performance. You actually get a little bit stronger processing out of it, and it can
because they had to have a bigger processor just to handle the color.
Well, and then just overall, they kind of brought things up to speed a little bit and said, okay, well, now we have the technology, we can get cheaper memory, we can do all these things, and so we're going to upgrade those. And so a lot of the manufacturers like LSDJ will take advantage of those upgrades and allow you to do even more with them. So that was kind of the other thing with Synthboy is that I didn't want to ignore the existing chip crowd. I really wanted them to be able to, if they were using LSDJ and they could literally just take out their cart and drop it into a Synthboy and output.
Right.
And that was kind of an unusual twist because it was like you said.
So
that
you do like the audio
parts.
output and everything through the stand piece as
Absolutely.
well, right? Okay.
Yep.
So literally, oh yeah, that's right, because you showed me it, and you have like some big ultra multi-pin connector at the bottom that you kind of glue. I gotta say, man, I don't even know how you're able to like wedge all this crap in, because I see some of this stuff and it's not minuscule, it's microscopic.
Well, I mean, the thing is that I didn't really invent anything. These guys were already there. They were already jamming all this stuff. And then what had happened was a guy named Nex, he goes by Nex, and his name's Ralph, and he just would do all of this stuff and even put more stuff than even I was putting inside the Game Boy shell. And I saw the vulnerability that if you dropped it or you did something, the $300 or $400 mod, it's gone. Right. Where I thought, well, there's got to be a little bit better way as far as just if you just literally wanted to use it for gigging and if you destroyed the Game Boy. So I kind of pulled out all the critical stuff and put it into the base. Therefore, if you lost the Game Boy or busted it...
So the Game Boy shell itself is nothing more than a bunch of routers to that multi-pin connector.
Absolutely.
And all of the groovy is in the base.
Absolutely.
Oh, okay.
So that way you could destroy the Game Boy and you wouldn't be freaking out. You'd have to mod one and put a connector in the bottom of it, but you wouldn't be freaking out that you just lost a $300 or $400 custom Game Boy. So that was kind of the other part of it. The other side benefit is that you could then obviously just pick it up, pop it in and take it on the bus, drop in LSDJ, do a tracker or mess around with some sounds, and then literally come back to the studio, drop it right back in
and go.
Yeah. So that was kind of a benefit.
That seems pretty cool.
The other thing that people don't know about that is that it is powered by the batteries that are in the Game Boy. So it does not need power. It's like its own little battery backup system. So if you keep 4 AA batteries in there and you lose all the power to the show, your Game Boy's still going because it'll power the Synthboy dock as well.
That's funny.
So
that's hilarious.
Yeah, kind of a side tidbit there.
So now, in addition to the Synthboy, which is pretty fun, and I hope people take the opportunity to go watch some videos on that. In addition to that, you have started doing just making wacky decisions about modifying things to work in Euro. And so, yeah, I remember you being there. I remember you coming to me afterwards, and after I did my little presentation, and asked me a little bit about where you would go to get started. And I made the mistake of pointing you at Muff Wiggler. So it's not me that makes you broke. It's but you also were talking at the time, you were like, well, I'm considering doing CV and gate out of this. And, I don't really have equipment to do that. Could I sometime come visit you and try it out? I was like, sure, that sounds great. I'd love to check it out, right? I never heard from you again. Because clearly you went home, got on Muff Wiggler, and by the end of the evening you had ordered like 12 U worth of stuff, right?
Yeah, it was like trial by fire. I literally wanted to learn as much as I could. Like you were saying before, when you were motivated, and the time just disappears, and so did the money in this case too. So you just got a chance to enjoy it. But it was a fascinating world because I kind of did remember MIDI, and I remember Commodore with MIDI, and I remember the starts of MIDI, and I kind of was interested in MIDI. But before then, I had to admit I really had no real exposure to analog and modular synths. So it was like a brand new world, and I wanted every bit of it. So
well, you seem to be all in now. But in addition, then to getting the Game Boy work or the Synthboy working in the environment, you have now also started making these oddities. And so the first one, well, I actually saw you sort of like hacking away at stuff. And you did like that function generator weirdo thing. And some other stuff. What was that function generator again? Can you explain that a little bit more? Because I don't even get what that was about.
We're still working on it. I'm actually working with another company on that. They're helping me. They're doing a lot of the design work. And I'm just kind of saying, well, it's a great scientific instrument, but if you looked at it from an audio perspective and we did this and that and added this, man, this would be extremely usable. Basically what that came down to is we're trying to get it to where I want to be able to kind of create my own digital wave. I want to be able to sample my own digital wave and be able to access those and just treat them.
Have it be usable in a modular environment.
Absolutely.
Still be accessible.
And it's all digital. I mean, and that's definitely going to draw away from all the analog folks. But I love the early sounds that just fits me very well with pushing a couple Arduinos to the limit as far as what you can do with real-time audio. That fits me very well now. And it's like a rebirth for me to get a chance to see it again happen on a ground level. So
well, the modular world is actually really kind of cool because... or I should say the Euro world, because I introduced you to some of my 5U friends, and they were less than generous about the work you had been doing. But nevertheless, the Euro world seems to be, it seems really open to everything. So it's sort of like, yeah, we want a great filter. Ooh, we want something that sounds like Buchla. Ooh, we want something that sounds like a Game Boy. Ooh, we want something that sounds like Optimus Prime. They want a little bit of everything.
Well, a good example is that Euro mod, or for the speak and read, because I mean I had done the Werkstatt Moog conversion just before that, and it basically got about 4,000 hits on YouTube in about in about a month or two, basically I think. Well, I let that speak and read go, and within one day I had that many hits. So you take this known brand like Moog and even what I thought would have been a thirst for a Moog Euro module, and yeah, it was there, but it was nothing like what I was expecting when the speaker.
But there is something about that whole speak and whatever thing. And, I Reed Gazala really jumped on that and got a lot of people excited about it through his circuit bending stuff. But, you actually kind of bringing it into play play in sort of an instrument. Is anyone doing sort of instruments based off of that aren't like purely circuit bent goo?
And I don't think so. I think that's one little spot that I could kind of give myself a niche to where that's kind of what I want. I don't want it. I mean, circuit bend's a great start. It's a great place to really kind of dive into it and learn what not to do. You can blow up stuff pretty quickly. But the challenge at that point is, how do I get this to where it's usable? Where does this going to actually fit into where people go? I mean, I saw one of the comments on Synthopia was like, yeah, this is the kind of thing I just buy and I basically neglect and wish I wouldn't have purchased. That's the kind of attitude I really try to get across that I don't want to have happen. I really want you to be able to dig into it and have it kind of keep rewarding you, even after the first.
I wonder to what extent some of the excitement behind something like the Speak and Read, though, too, is it because people know what it is? I mean, if you made it for Blinglin later, right?
Absolutely.
People will be like, oh, cool, you made a thing, and it does a thing, and I don't know if I need that, right? But if you got a speaking speller tool that can blurt out a bunch of words and sound kind of like insane while doing it, who doesn't want that, right? Well, who can't find a use for that?
And I kind of cheesed it up a little bit. I mean, I went straight after the yellow, and I went right after the green, and I mean, I made it just look exactly like it. So.
It's shocking. And how did you do that? I mean, how much of that was just you cutting out the faceplate, and how much did you have to completely fab and paint a whole new thing?
Well, and I mean, some of my background, I mean, that's really what I am. I'm a screen printer and modular guy. I mean, as far as the understanding of building metal plates for equipment and things that have labels on them. I mean, I've got probably over 2 decades of screen printing metal parts. And so a lot of people don't even know the background that I have that much in screen printing. Right. But then fabrication, I brought fabrication under and started CNC and building my own panels. Because mostly out of the need to make my own stuff, to cut the holes in the top of the synth boys and the shells.
Right.
And so it was more of a fill the need. And for me, that's what learning in life is about, because I find myself in the position to where it's like, okay, well, I could spend $3,000 and give it to somebody else to have them cut these holes in here, or I can just go and spend the $3,000, get the machine,
and be able to cut holes forever.
Absolutely. Teach a man to fish. I mean, it really is for me. So, but up until that point, I can't learn. It's strange. It's like if I sit in front of a book or a TV or a screen and it's not something I can apply directly, man, I cannot retain that information. But if it's relevant to exactly what I'm doing, absolutely, I will remember it forever.
Interesting. So, to do all the things it takes to make a synth boy or to make a Speak and Read Euro module, or to work with a company to make a digital function generator usable as a musical instrument, or whatever, it strikes me that you have to kind of know a little bit about a zillion things, right?
That's accurate.
But with some of this stuff, like for me, I would think that getting the things right, as they're connected to the Gameboy, requires like super depth knowledge about a relatively few things. How do you, what are the things that you collaborate with people on? What are the things that you do yourself because damn it, you're going to do it? And what are the things that you just don't care about and you'll just let fly?
It's tough because there's a lot of different variables there. I mean, there's some things that are just falling into place. There's other, like the project I'm working on now. The IP is essentially somebody else's. They've actually done the work, but they've kind of dropped the ball and they're ignoring this whole opportunity that could be if they would just develop it a little bit further, just a little bit further on that teeter-totter. And so it's frustrating because you find yourself sitting and waiting, but at the same time, you're trying to figure out, how could I use this a little better? How could I refine this? How could I make it work a little better? How could I make it usable? And that all of a sudden builds into what you then kind of somewhat turn into your own product, even though it's based on a lot, on other people's work and other people's stuff. So some people are more open about it. They're willing to accept it and let it out as public domain. Other people are more stingy and are afraid that if they let it out, that it's going to go away from them and it's no longer theirs. Right. And that's a tough situation. You see that even in modular, with people supposedly stealing circuits and different things. And unless I think you're 100% copying something verbatim,
which I think we've seen too,
right?
A little bit.
Absolutely. But if you're bringing something else to the table and you're adding something or some usability or some format or function or accessibility, or you're doing something that's bringing real usability out of the product, I don't think it's no longer that person's 100%.
Well, I think the other thing too is that I think that actually some of the capabilities of the analog side of things, the number of choices that are out there are actually being reduced by the day, right? So it's getting to this point that if you're going to do an analog shift register, you're probably building it off of a specific chip, which is the same chip that everyone else that's doing an ASR is using. And so, I mean, given that you all are using the same engine and powertrain, it seems a little odd to call any of it theft. Now, I'm sure that, there are other people that would strongly disagree with that. But, I don't know. It's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine people getting as worked up as they do sometimes.
Well, I've got a fan in Perth, Australia. Her name is Samantha. And she's great because she's focused on the music. She really is. And the music she turns out is pretty fun, just enjoyable. But she's not really on the technical side of it as far as the gear and how to modify it and all that. So I find myself just, able to support her in doing what she does. And that brings me joy. Right. So if the community wants to come after me and say that I'm, solely based on just doing parts of it for money, well, as we all know, money is just the necessary evil in order to keep continuing doing what you're doing. Right. My first year in Instrument was a $20,000 loss. Right. So it's not like I'm just sitting on all my ducats and just excited, and just...
your great big Scrooge McDuck stack of coin.
It's hard because, I've worked hard for my money, and you see some of my toys, and you see that I've got a lot of stuff, but what people don't realize is that it's not money coming from the synth boy. That's just a literal...
You're one of the hardest working people I've ever met.
Yeah, so I just enjoy tinkering, and I love putting out stuff. And like you mentioned the Pro Look, I'm going to kind of hit on that a little. That's just from, repeatedly messing things up and failing. I think I burned out my first couple speak and reads and learned what not to do. And a lot of people at that point will get discouraged. Right. And they'll be like, I saw this guy do it and I should be able to do it. Yeah, realize that I failed too, and that it's okay to fail. In fact, a lot of times you will discover more things when you fail than you will when it's finished and completed. When I finally did let it go, the speak and read Euro module, I just thought, for me, it was a release like, okay, what's next? And then all of a sudden it kind of blew up a little bit and you got all this, hubbub about it. And for me, it was just like, it's okay. What's next? Keep going. Don't stop. Just keep working on what you're doing next. And if people like what you're doing, then they'll support you. Yeah. And I'm lucky because I have a lot of international support, and I have to thank a lot of people in Japan and Germany and Australia, UK. Without those people, then I wouldn't be able to continue.
All right. Well, Chris, on that note, I want to wrap this up because this has been one of the longer interviews anyway. I apologize for that.
No problem.
It seemed like we just burned right through the time. But it was really interesting to kind of catch your perspectives, but also with the words of saying, "Hey, go ahead and blow stuff up." That's
Absolutely.
part of the fun.
Absolutely.
I can really appreciate and resonate with that. So thank you so much.
Excellent.
And have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Darwin.
All right. Wow, that was fun. Another great chat in the bag. I want to take the opportunity again to thank everybody involved. Everybody that helps make this possible, including Synthopia, Great Digital Music, Cycling 74, and most importantly, you, the listeners. Again, as always, if you have any questions, comments, or ideas, please shoot me an email at ddg@cycling74.com. Thanks a lot, and I'll talk to you next week.